Welcome to the fifth presentation in the series on understanding the universal business language. This tutorial will focus on the use case for transportation of goods, the use case and some of the concepts that were used in the design of UBL. First of all, let's clarify the definition of transportation. In the UBL context, we mean the conveyance of goods. And there are, in fact, two different process models for how conveyance of goods can be implemented in UBL. One we refer to as just freight management or international freight management, and the other one is intermodal freight management. And we'll talk a bit about the difference of those in a minute. The parties involved in the transportation process involve people like consignees and consignors, carriers and freight forwarders. So we introduce the idea of intermediaries into the process of document exchange. Two of the other concepts we need to clarify are shipment and consignment. We'll talk a bit about those in a moment. And also the definition of goods items, be they goods or services, and how items are transported. So the overall scope of the transportation process within UBL covers what's called the plan, execute and complete phases. So planning of transporting of goods involves things like providing forwarding instructions, possibly certificates that are required for that, and requests for service. So this is the arrangement of the transport, the booking, for example. That plan is then executed, and that may require things like dispatch advices and packing lists and waybills, bills of lading. And this is where the goods actually move, so there's often a need to report the status of that transaction. Where are they? And finally, there's the completion, when the goods arrive. The receipt advices, so the freight may be invoiced. And again, there'll be a transportation status to denote that the goods have been delivered. I mentioned earlier that there are two different models inside UBL for describing the freight management process. One, which is the, if you like, traditional or the international freight management process, covers the plan, execute and complete phases using documents like forwarding instructions and packing lists and bills of lading and waybills and transportation status messages. And those pass between the consignee, the freight forwarder, and the freight forwarder and the carrier, and the freight forwarder and the consignor. The activity diagram here, you can see, is fairly complicated, but there are 4 swim lanes: consignee, consignor, freight forwarder, and carrier, demonstrating a typical process. So anyone who's been involved in international freight will recognize some of these document types: forwarding instructions, packing lists, bills of lading and waybill, transportation status and freight invoice. So these are things which you would expect to see in an international shipping process, and UBL provides XML schema for all of those. But there is a second model, which is, if you like, an emerging model based upon the concept of intermodal or multimodal freight management. And this implies that there is a combination of transport modes. So instead of having a different process for shipping goods by sea or by air or by road and rail, we have a common process that applies to all transport modes. And that introduces the generic role for party. You're either a user of the service, you're a provider of the service, or you manage the network of the service. And the intermodal freight process covers plan, execute and completion with different document types. The planning is done through a transport service request or a description request and a transport execution plan and its request for one. It's also the goods being shipped are described using a document called the goods item itinerary. To execute that plan, there is then a transport execution plan passed between the transport service provider and the transport user. And there are various status or progress requests that go between all parties to synchronize on this movement. And finally, when it's completed, a freight invoice can be created. So that's a typical intermodal freight management process that's based on a generic concept of roles defined based on the function and document types that are based upon the requirement for that particular step of the process. So this is a redesign of the international freight process, designed to be generic for all modes of transport. It was developed and contributed to UBL through a European Commission e-freight project, which is now part of their iCargo service. The transport service description request and the transport service description are part of the planning process. The transport execution plan is really a equivalent of a forwarding instruction, and there's both a request and a plan to denote one is asking for something and one is stating what's possible. You can also request a transport status and receive one, and you can get progress reports. And probably the most significant difference in this model is that there is a goods item itinerary. So the information about the goods, the equipment, the service providers, the movement, the contractual arrangements are carried as a separate document because that is independent of the mode of transport. Regardless of which model you follow in the transport chain, there are some common components, and I'll focus on 4 of those in this presentation: the consignment, the transport handling unit, the goods items, and the shipment stage. So the terms shipment and consignment have precise meaning in UBL, and they do have a different meaning. UBL uses the term shipment to describe the commercial arrangement between a shipper and a shippee, typically a buyer and a seller. So the shipment is often called the logical or the commercial view of a transportation. It will identify one or more goods items to be transported between the ultimate recipient and the original sender. A shipment can actually be broken up. So a particular order for an item may actually involve several deliveries, and that would be split for logistical purposes. A consignment is a more physical view of the transport of goods. It describes what actually is going to happen or what actually has happened in terms of the movement of the good. So it is a collection of goods items from a consignee to a consignor using one or more modes of transport. And a consignment may also be broken down, and it may also be consolidated. So we can have a consignment with more than one shipment. What this means is the relationship between shipment and consignment is a true many-to-many relationship. A shipment can cover many consignments, a consignment can cover many shipments. And that model is really an explanation of why intermediaries, or the function of intermediaries such as freight forwarders, operate. So the diagram here, which is fairly complicated, explains the fact that the relationship or the movement of goods between a supplier, in this case supplier A and buyer A, is a shipment. They will talk to each other about the shipment that they're expecting or they're sending. That shipment, in the most simple sense, would also be the consignment if supplier A and buyer A were dealing with the physical movement of the goods. Supplier A may provide the truck, for example, that delivers to buyer A, and that would be a consignment is one shipment. But in most situations, and certainly international freight, there is intermediaries, there are forwarders involved. And those intermediaries will take those consignments and they will consolidate them for economics of shipping. And then they will deconsolidate them at the other end for delivery to the respective parties. So it's important when we're looking at the information structures inside UBL to recognize that even though when we look at a shipment and we look at a consignment structure, they're very similar, they're performing a different function and they're focusing on a different aspect. The shipment is focusing on the commercial relationship and the consignment is focusing on the logistical relationship. Now here, I'm afraid we have to start condensing the information. So some of these structures are fairly large, and you'll see consignment is one of those. And I apologize for the small font, but it's the only way we could fit this in. The first thing to notice in the structure of consignment is that there are various identification schemes. So a carrier can assign an identifier, so can the consignee or consignor. The forwarder involved or the broker can also assign one. And there may be subcontractors, contracted carriers and performing carriers, who also have their own identifier for this consignment. Similarly, a consignment may need to flag the type of cargo involved. If there's foodstuffs, if it's got special security conditions, whether it's in containers, whether it's got hazardous goods. These are all indicators on the consignment. And if we go to the second half of the consignment, you can also see that it contains information about transport events. And the transport event is a useful structure within UBL that allows a fairly broad range of events to be reported. Some of the ones we flagged here are the requested and planned pickup and delivery, but there are many others you could define for this. Probably most significant in this structure is the number of parties involved. Obviously, all of these are optional, but there can be many. The other significant part is the traditional three primary stages of the shipment: the main, the pre, and the on carriage. Shipment stages we'll talk a little bit about later. And finally, there are the goods themselves. The transport handling unit. Transport handling unit is a term that's been picked up from the industry, and it relates to the device or the object that the goods are packed in that can be handled by a piece of transport handling equipment. So it could be a pallet, it could be a box, it could be a barrel. A transport handling is in fact often codified into what type of transport handling unit we're referring to. And again, below the level of the consignment, we can also have things like whether it's hazardous. We now need to know about things like the quantities involved, transport equipment. Sometimes these are put inside containers, so we need to know about that. And various temperatures and dimensions that are involved, whether there's been customs declarations made on this. What I want to focus on here is that the transport handling unit contains one or more, it's unbounded, goods items. So this is where we find out what's in the box. And goods items are items that have additional information on them. Some of this information relates to customs, for example, the value amount, the tariff, and the quantity, and the status, of course, whether it's had clearance or not from customs. Obviously, a goods item is an item in movement, so it's an item that's being shipped. And so it has information about the weights and measures and sizes. It also has information about where it's going to, where it's delivery, where it's picked up from, whether this goods item contains other goods items, because they can be nested inside each other, and any temperature controls and documentation that may be required. And finally, I want to talk a bit about shipment stages, because any transport, and certainly international transport, involves more than one stage. Often delivery from a wharf or a terminal or a freight depot. So I mentioned that consignments have stages, and the things we need to know about shipment stages are things about the location, the events I've mentioned before, and you can see how many transport events that we capture as part of a shipment stage, or we can capture. And of course information about people involved too. Often for safety and for regulatory requirement, we need to know those things. So typically a delivery of goods would involve several shipment stages. And that's where we enter into the intermodal part of this. Some of these are dependent upon a particular mode of transport. So let's put some of that together and describe a case study, a very simplistic example. And following on from some of the scenarios we've used in other tutorials, where this company IYT was buying beeswax from a company called Consortial. Well, it turns out that Consortial are shipping out of their US office to IYT in the UK using a company called One Stop Forwarders. So let's just briefly look at how those parties, the new parties involved in this scenario, would be described. So we have a carrier party here, United Air Freight, and there's some information about their contact. And then the freight forwarder party that we've mentioned before, One Stop Forwarders, and a bit more information about them, their address and their contact. I apologize again, this is difficult to read, but I wanted to put the whole thing on one slide. So this is a consignment structure in UBL describing that shipment of beeswax. A couple of things to point out in this. The consignment is identified using this rather complicated number, which is actually what's called a unique consignment reference number following the WCO algorithm for developing consignment reference numbers. So in theory, at least, that number would uniquely identify this consignment anywhere in the world. There's a description of the goods for tariff customs purposes, beeswax, and its tariff code 1521900. It's marked as not being hazardous. We now have information about the consignee party. Here's IYT Corporation, we've seen before, and the person to contact. Its original departure country is the US, its final destination is Great Britain. There is a transport contract based on a forwarding instruction issued on this date, valid for this period. And that describes the original service, door-to-door and peer-to-peer. Door-to-door for the original dispatch and peer-to-peer for the final delivery. The terms of delivery are FOB at the destination, and the location here is Bristol. In fact, that low-code GBBRS is Bristol Airport. And finally, there are some freight allowances here, or charges in this case, $254. The goods item, i.e. this is describing the item and its shipment, how it was shipped, is for beeswax as follows. So again, now we have a declared customs amount, a statistical value, which is often required, the FOB value of the goods, the actual value of the goods without the freight, and the gross weights, net weights, gross volumes and net volumes. All of these obviously are useful information for the transport service providers. The quantity, in this case the quantity of goods items, not the quantity of items, and in customs, a customs clearance number, for example, and status, how many were declared for tariff purposes, and there's the identification. And as a minor variant on the theme, we've made the origin country of this goods Mexico. So potentially there would be a certificate of origin that also accompanies this transaction. Here's an example of a transport handling unit. As I said, often think of these as pallets. They are coded, and PA happens to be the UNECE TRED 8053 code for a pallet. There are 10, and 10 in each pallet. Actual packages of 10, and inside them they are UNECE code 21 TB, which I think is tubs, if I remember, the barrels. And then we come to the shipment stage itself. This is describing, this is the main carriage of the shipment stage. So again, we have a transport mode, which is coded, and number 4 is air. Transport means, which is airplane or plane. It's neither pre nor on carriage because it is the main carriage. It has a transit period, a starting date. Here's the carrier, Air Freight, United Air Freight, and a transport means. So the journey, which in this case would be the flight number, is 1234. The identification of the aircraft is the aeroplane registration number. And then now we have information about the loading port, unloading port, and transshipment. So we can see that the goods were loaded at Boston Airport. There's its UN load code. It was unloaded at Bristol, but it was transshipped through Heathrow. So that was a very brief introduction to UBL's application in a transportation scenario, and I gave you a very simple case study of how that could look. So thank you very much for that.